right now, as you listen to this, there are 20 million barrels of oil that are just physically trapped in a 21-mile stretch of water.
Yeah.
Like, it is Sunday, March 29th, 2026, and the global economy is effectively having a heart attack. I mean, someone has basically pressed their thumb down hard on, one of the most vital exposed arteries of international trade, and the entire system is suffocating.
It really is. That's the stark reality of a geopolitical bottleneck just being slammed shut, because we've built this incredibly complex, interconnected world that relies on the uninterrupted flow of resources. But that flow is, it's far more fragile than we like to admit.
Oh, totally. And the timeline of how we got to this total paralysis is just stunningly compressed. Like, exactly 1 month ago on February 28th, there was a joint U.S. and Israeli military strike.
Yeah.
And they targeted Iranian nuclear naval bases.
Right.
And, the geopolitical rationale presented for that strike was to halt nuclear weapons development and curb regional destabilization. But the retaliation, it wasn't just a localized military counterattack. The very next day, March 1st, Iran targeted the foundational machinery of global commerce. I mean, they closed the Strait of Hormuz.
Which brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We are taking a vast stack of your sources to understand the anatomy of this crisis. We have the OECD's latest March 2026 economic outlook. We've got incredibly granular energy flow data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration.
Yeah, the EIA data is wild.
It is. And we're also pulling from historical military analyses published in War on the Rocks, geopolitical intelligence briefs from the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, and several peer-reviewed journals on international maritime law.
Right, so our goal is to synthesize all of this. We want to understand the exact physical and military mechanics of how a single, narrow waterway can bring the modern world to a complete standstill.
Please.
We're going to look at the historical precedents, because we have actually seen variations of this playbook before, and we're going to trace the massive economic shockwaves that are, hitting your wallet right now.
Yeah, the inflation data alone is staggering.
We'll get to that, yeah. And finally, we will wade into the murky, highly contested waters of international law that are supposed to prevent this very scenario. So, okay, let's unpack this. We're promising you an objective, jargon-free journey through the geopolitics, the naval strategies, and the severe economic realities of the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis.
That's good.
So let's start with the physical geography. Like, just how massive of a choke point are we talking about here?
Well, to understand the leverage at play here, you really have to look at the sheer volume being forced through that space. Before the March 1 closure, the Strait of Hormuz handled 20 million barrels of petroleum products every single day.
Every day. That number is almost too large to even visualize. 20 million barrels, day in and day out.
Yeah, it's immense. To ground that in the broader global context, 20 million barrels equates to a full 20% of total global petroleum consumption.
Wow.
It represents over a quarter of all global seaborne oil trade. And crucially, we aren't just talking about crude oil sitting in tankers. The Strait also handles roughly 1/5 of the entire global trade in liquefied natural gas, or LNG.
And a lot of that is from Qatar, right?
Yes, the vast majority of that LNG is coming out of Qatar, loaded onto highly specialized cryogenic ships. So when the Strait closes, you are instantaneously pulling 1/5 of the world's energy supply off the board.
Just gone. Which brings us to the actual physical dimensions of this waterway.
Yeah.
Because if you look at a map, the strait sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, bottlenecking the exit into the Gulf of Oman and out toward the Arabian Sea. It lies between Iran to the north and the Musandam Peninsula of Oman to the south. And at its absolute narrowest point, the distance from shore to shore is 21 miles. Now, to a layperson, 21 miles sounds like a massive expanse of open water. I mean, you'd assume ships could just, spread out, hug the southern coastline, and sail right through.
Right, but that is a really common misconception about maritime navigation. The ocean is not uniformly deep, and supertankers are colossal pieces of engineering.
Right.
Like a fully loaded, very large crude carrier, a VLCC, has a draft of over 20 meters. That's the distance between the waterline and the bottom of the ship's hull.
They sit deep in the water.
Exactly. So they require deep, heavily surveyed channels to avoid running aground.
And the EIA data spells out just how restrictive those channels actually are. I mean, the actual navigable shipping lanes are incredibly tight. You have just two primary channels, one for inbound traffic, one for outbound. And each channel is only 3.2 kilometers wide. That's roughly 2 miles. And separating these two lanes is a buffer zone that is also just 3.2 kilometers wide. That means all of that traffic, all 20 million barrels a day, is forced into a highly predictable, densely packed, 6-mile wide corridor.
Yeah, and furthermore, the northern inbound channel runs within a few dozen kilometers of the deeply indented, island-dotted Iranian coastline.
Oh, why?
Yeah, so it forces every inbound empty tanker and every outbound fully loaded supertanker to sail directly under the geographic shadow of the northern shore.
Okay, but I have to push back on this geographic determinism a little bit, because we're living in the 21st century. We know how to build infrastructure. Like if you have a massive 6-lane highway that constantly gets blocked at a single toll booth, the logical engineering solution is to build a detour.
Sure.
So why are we utterly dependent on a single body of water when we have the technology to build massive overland pipelines to just bypass the strait entirely?
Well, the detours do exist, and your sources detail them extensively. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates recognized this exact strategic vulnerability decades ago, and they built infrastructure specifically designed to bypass the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, so they did do that.
They did. For instance, Saudi Aramco operates the massive east-west crude oil pipeline. This system runs from their primary oil processing centers in the eastern province all the way across the Arabian Peninsula to the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea coast.
Got it. So if the front door is blocked, they just route the oil out the back door to the Red Sea.
They do, but there is a severe mathematical ceiling to that solution. The pipeline has physical engineering limits. You can't simply turn a dial and force infinite pressure through a steel pipe.
Right.
Right now, operating at its absolute maximum stress capacity, the Saudi east-west pipeline can move 7 million barrels per day. But the domestic math complicates this. Well, Saudi Arabia needs roughly 2 million of those barrels for its own domestic refineries along the western coast. So that leaves only about 5 million barrels of crude, plus perhaps 1 million barrels of refined products that can actually be exported out of Yanbu to the global market.
Let's factor in the other regional players then. Because the UAE also has a bypass system, right? They built the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, which links their onshore fields directly to the Fujairah export terminal, which sits safely on the Gulf of Oman side of the strait.
Yes, that pipeline is critical, but again, capacity is restricted. Its maximum throughput is 1.8 million barrels per day.
Only 1.8.
Yeah. Even ERA attempted to build its own bypass, the Gorajask pipeline, to ensure its exports could continue if the strait became impassable. But the EIA analysis notes that the Iranian pipeline's effective capacity was only ever around 300,000 barrels per day, and its operations were effectively halted due to technical and maintenance issues in late 2024.
So when we actually do the math on these multi-billion-dollar detours, the reality is pretty grim. You have the Saudis pushing maybe 6 million export barrels to the Red Sea. The UAE is pushing 1.8 million to the Gulf of Oman. We are looking at roughly 8 million barrels being successfully rerouted.
Exactly, leaving a massive structural deficit. The strait normally handles 20 million barrels, so even with every pump on every bypass pipeline running at redline capacity, the global market is suddenly facing a catastrophic shortfall of 12 to 15 million barrels of oil every single day that simply cannot physically reach the ocean.
That's insane.
The pipelines act as a fragile stopgap, but they are fundamentally incapable of curing the underlying supply shock.
And reading through the geopolitical analysis from the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, that Saudi bypass creates a secondary nightmare.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the oil pump to Yanbu doesn't just magically appear in Europe or Asia, it gets loaded onto tankers in the Red Sea. And the Red Sea has become an intensely dangerous neighborhood over the last few years, primarily due to Houthi militant operations launching out of Yemen and targeting commercial shipping passing through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait.
Yeah, this illustrates the concept of compounded regional risk. You are taking ships that would normally sail safely across the Arabian Sea, and you're forcing them to navigate a different choke point, currently fraught with asymmetric warfare.
Right.
While the late March data indicates that these specific rewrited tankers haven't suffered a direct hit yet, the threat environment is astronomical. The insurance markets price that risk in, making the detour incredibly expensive even before the oil reaches the Mediterranean or the Indian Ocean.
So geography really sets the stage here.
Yeah.
But geography alone doesn't magically halt global trade. You need military enforcement to actively block the water. Which brings us to a really fascinating tactical question. How exactly is Iran enforcing this blockade? Because they're enforcing it against highly advanced, technologically superior Western navies that patrol the region.
Yes, they are.
How does a regional power choke off a vital strait when they are facing the U.S. Navy?
Well, they rely entirely on a military doctrine known as anti-accessory denial, commonly abbreviated as A2AD. This is the foundational strategy for any strategically or numerically weaker force facing a superpower.
Okay.
The objective in an A2AD campaign is not to sail your fleet out into the open ocean, meet a U.S. carrier strike group in symmetrical combat, and try to sink it. That would be immediate strategic suicide.
Right, because in a traditional open water naval battle with what they call a blue water environment, the U.S. Navy's radar, air power, and long-range missiles will just absolutely dominate.
Correct. The goal of A2AD is entirely different. It is designed to change the cost-benefit analysis of the adversary. Iran's objective is to make simply entering the confined, shallow waters of the Strait of Hormuz so incredibly dangerous and so potentially costly in terms of lost ships and human lives that the adversary chooses not to risk it.
Just keep them out entirely.
It is the ultimate form of asymmetric warfare.
I look at it like fighting a swarm of angry bees with a sledgehammer. Like, the U.S. Navy is the sledgehammer. It's devastatingly powerful, incredibly expensive, capable of crushing anything it hits. But a sledgehammer is fundamentally the wrong physical tool to fight 1,000 bees swarming in a confined space.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the littoral combat environment. And Iran has spent decades building a highly specialized, multi-layered arsenal of denial, specifically engineered for the unique bathymetry and geography of the Persian Gulf.
Wow.
And the very first and arguably the most terrifying layer of this defense is the naval mine. The military estimates in your sources indicate Iran possesses a stockpile of over 6,000 naval mines.
See, when most people think of a naval mine, they picture an old World War II movie. Like a big, rusty, spiky iron ball floating right on the surface of the water, just waiting for a ship to bump into it. But the technology detailed in the War on the Rocks piece is vastly more sophisticated than that.
Far more sophisticated. While they do still possess simple contact mines, the core of their threat relies on influence mines.
Influence mines.
Yeah, these sit dormant, resting quietly on the seafloor, sometimes hundreds of feet down. Take the acoustic mine, for example. It's programmed to ignore the ambient noise of the ocean or the sound of a small fishing dhow passing by.
Right.
But when it detects the specific acoustic signature, the massive low-frequency cavitation bubbles collapsing off the massive propellers of a fully loaded supertanker or a military destroyer, it wakes up and detonates beneath the hull.
That's terrifying. And the magnetic mines operate on a similar principle of physics, right?
Yeah.
Like, they don't need to be physically touched. They just wait for a massive steel hull to pass overhead, which creates a localized anomaly in the Earth's magnetic field.
Exactly.
And the mine detects that magnetic shift and explodes upward, targeting the weakest part of the ship, which is its keel.
Right. And what makes this mine threat so potent is the deployment vector. Iran does not need large, specialized, easily identifiable mine-laying warships.
They don't.
No. They can seed these minefields using their fleet of diesel-electric submarines, from swarms of small, fast attack craft, or even covertly from nondescript civilian vessels. A traditional wooden dhow or a rust bucket commercial freighter could be secretly manned by naval personnel, dropping mines out of hidden trapdoors in the hull at night.
Unbelievable. Which means mapping and clearing those minefields is just a logistical nightmare.
Absolutely.
But let's say a U.S. Navy minesweeper does manage to clear a safe lane. They still have to contend with the second layer of the A2AD fortress, right? The anti-ship cruise missiles, or ASCMs.
Right. Because the strait is only 21 miles wide, Iran doesn't need highly expensive long-range ballistic missiles to hit a target. They can rely on a massive inventory of relatively cheap, short to medium-range cruise missiles.
And they hide them, right?
Exactly. These batteries are mounted on mobile launchers, hidden deep inside the coastal mountain ranges, or stationed on the numerous small islands Iran occupies within the Gulf, such as Qashm or Abu Musa.
And the really terrifying part is that the missile launchers themselves don't even need to emit a radar signal to find their target, because emitting radar would normally give away their position to U.S. forces immediately.
Yeah, they'd be targeted right back.
Right, so they can stay completely dark, hiding in a cave, and receive target coordinates via encrypted data link from a drone loitering 50 miles away, or from a submarine pinging the target.
It creates a deadly littoral trap. And to protect those coastal missile batteries from being bombed by U.S. aircraft, Iran deploys the third layer of the system, a robust air defense network.
Okay.
While their surface-to-air missile network may not match the numerical superiority of Western air forces, it is dense enough and deeply entrenched enough to prevent adversaries from easily establishing the total air superiority required to hunt down every single hidden missile launcher and fast attack boat.
Reading through the historical analysis, what becomes immediately apparent is that none of this is theoretical. We have actually seen this exact playbook executed in these very waters. There are profound historical echoes here. The sources dive deep into the tanker war phase of the brutal Iran-Iraq conflict back in the 1980s.
Right, and understanding the 1980s tanker war is absolutely vital to comprehending the psychology and the tactics of the 2026 crisis.
Yeah.
During that conflict, both Iran and Iraq realized they couldn't decisively defeat each other on the battlefield, so they began attacking each other's oil commerce to starve their opponent of the economic lifeblood needed to fund the war.
It was an economic war as much as a physical one.
Exactly. And the situation in the Gulf deteriorated so rapidly that Kuwait, fearing its entire economy would collapse, formally requested the United States to reflag Kuwaiti oil tankers as American vessels.
And the logic there being that if a ship is flying the American flag, it falls under the sovereign protection of the United States military, and Iran wouldn't dare attack a U.S. flag vessel. And that initiated Operation Earnest Will in the summer of 1987.
That was the strategic assumption, yeah. But the reality of maritime conflict shattered that assumption almost immediately.
Wow.
In July of 1987, the U.S. Navy organized the very first massive convoy. They had high-tech guided missile cruisers and destroyers escorting these newly reflagged supertankers. They sailed right into the Persian Gulf. And the MV Bridgerton, which was a massive 400,000-ton supertanker in that first convoy, struck an Iranian contact mine.
Man. And the explosion tore a 50-square-meter hole in the ship's steel hull. It was a massive psychological blow. The Iranians effectively called the American bluff, proving that an underwater explosive doesn't care what color flag is painted on the ship's mast.
It does.
In fact, after the explosion, the massive, heavily armed U.S. warships actually had to fall in line and sail behind the crippled Bridgerton, using its massive hull as a shield against further mines, because the warships lacked adequate mine detection sonar.
It demonstrated a severe vulnerability in traditional naval doctrine. The U.S. realized they had to shift tactics from simply escorting ships to actively hunting down the mine layers before the weapons ever entered the water.
Which leads to this incredible, almost cinematic sequence detailed in the War on the Rocks analysis. In September 1987, the U.S. military realizes that giant radar-emitting destroyers aren't going to catch small boats sneaking around in the dark. So they deploy Army Special Operations helicopters, the MH-6 Little Birds.
Yeah, these were small, highly agile helicopters equipped with advanced night vision technology operating in total darkness over the Gulf. On the night of September 21st, a helicopter crew spotted an Iranian amphibious landing ship called the Iran.
Right. And the ship had turned off all its running lights, operating under the assumption that the darkness of the Gulf would hide them from visual detection. But the American helicopter crews were watching them clearly through infrared night vision.
Right.
They hovered silently and watched as the Iranian crew pulled back a large tarp on the deck. And the soldiers started pushing what looked to the pilots like ordinary shopping carts over the side of the ship into the dark water.
Yeah, those shopping carts were actually specially designed deployment cradles holding acoustic and magnetic naval mines.
Wow.
The helicopter crews instantly radioed back to their command ship, confirmed they were witnessing active mine laying in international shipping lanes, and received immediate authorization to engage. The Little Birds attacked the Iranajar with rockets and minigun fire, completely disabling the vessel and catching them red-handed in the act of mining the transit corridors.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the U.S. military quickly realized a fundamental truth about operating in the Persian Gulf. Bringing multi-billion-dollar destroyers into these narrow, shallow, mine-infested waters just to hunt down wooden speedboats and hidden mine layers was incredibly inefficient and wildly dangerous.
Too risky.
Way too risky. They needed a different platform. They needed what naval architects call mobile sea bases. And I find this concept utterly fascinating. It is essentially the engineering challenge of building a self-sustaining, floating fortress right in the middle of hostile territory.
It represents a remarkable evolution in naval strategy, and the lineage traced in the source material is deeply revealing because the fundamental concept actually originated during the Vietnam War.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The U.S. Navy needed to project power deep into the shallow, muddy rivers of the Mekong Delta, where traditional warships just couldn't go. So they lashed massive riverine barges together, moored them in the Delta, and used them as floating staging areas for small patrol boats and helicopter squads.
So, when the U.S. found itself fighting a shallow water conflict in the Persian Gulf in the 1980s, they basically dusted off that Vietnam-era playbook.
Precisely. During Operation Earnest Will, the military leased two massive commercial oil industry barges, the Hercules and the Wim-Brown VII. They towed them directly into the international waters of the Persian Gulf and parked them there to serve as stationary motherships.
They welded helicopter landing pads onto the decks. They installed heavy cranes that could physically lift special operations patrol boats out of the water to hide them or repair them. They built armored housing units for Navy SEALs, Marine recon teams, and aviators.
By establishing these floating bases, the military could maintain a constant, sustained 247 operational presence right inside the Iranian backyard.
Right, they didn't have to commute.
Exactly. They didn't have to waste fuel and time transiting back and forth from friendly ports in Bahrain or Saudi Arabia. And most importantly, it allowed them to utilize small, agile assets without risking a $2 billion Aegis cruiser in a brown water knife fight.
And that strategic lineage hasn't disappeared. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it has evolved directly into today's modern naval structure. The sources point specifically to ships like the USS Louis B. Puller.
Yeah, the Louis B. Puller is the ultimate modern iteration of that 1980s barge concept. It is classified as an expeditionary sea base. Interestingly, it's actually built on the massive hull profile of an Alaska-class commercial oil tanker, rather than a sleek destroyer hull.
That makes sense. More room.
It gives it immense buoyancy and deck space. It features a massive flight deck capable of handling heavy-lift helicopters and V-22 Osprey tilt-rotor aircraft. And below that, it has an expansive mission deck designed specifically to launch small tactical boats and deploy unmanned underwater vehicles to hunt for mines.
And it operates with a hybrid crew, right? Civilian mariners handle the navigation and propulsion of the ship itself, while military personnel handle the combat and aviation operations. It just operates as a mobile, self-sustaining, sovereign island for mine countermeasures and special operations.
Right, and the technological integration continues to accelerate. The 2026 sources highlight how, beginning in late 2023, the U.S. Fifth Fleet, based in Bahrain, began heavily integrating unmanned platforms into these operations. We're talking about solar-powered drone boats that can stay at sea for months, scanning for anomalies, and autonomous submarine gliders mapping the seafloor for freshly laid mines.
So you have this relentless, high-tech, incredibly tense cat-and-mouse game playing out on the surface and beneath the waves of the Persian Gulf.
Yeah.
But as fascinating as the military hardware is, we have to recognize that the consequences of this standoff are violently breaking out of that 21-mile geographic box. Like the navies are maneuvering, but the economic blast radius is hitting civilian bank accounts, retirement funds, and grocery receipts all over the planet. We must pivot from the military theater to the global economic shockwave.
Yes. To understand the severity of the shock, we really have to look at the baseline data from the March 2026 OECD report and the economic modeling from the HIA. The tragedy of this crisis is the timing. Just before this conflict erupted in late 2025, the global economy was actually demonstrating remarkable resilience. Economic growth was tracking at a solid 3.25%. We had navigated the post-pandemic inflation spikes, and the massive capital investments pouring into the AI and advanced tech sectors were driving a wave of high productivity growth. Central banks were preparing for a soft landing.
But the moment the strait closed on March 1st, that soft landing just evaporated.
Completely.
The immediate reaction across global commodity markets was violent. From the start of the conflict on February 28 to March 20, global oil prices surged by a staggering 50%. The benchmark Brent crude, which essentially dictates the baseline price for oil worldwide, spiked dramatically. And because energy markets are interlinked, it wasn't just oil. The Dutch TTF gas benchmark, which serves as the primary pricing standard for European natural gas, also rocketed upward by 50% as the realization set in that Qatari LNG was trapped.
We also have to address a crucial economic mechanism that acts as a multiplier in this crisis, and that's the concept of insurance as a weapon of war.
Oh, this is huge.
It is. Iran does not actually have to physically sink a tanker every day to close the strait. They simply have to engage in enough credible harassment to terrify the actuaries sitting in underwriting offices in London. The moment the threat level rises, maritime insurance premiums for vessels attempting to navigate anywhere near the region spike exponentially.
The sources indicate war risk premiums jumped by 50% almost overnight.
Yeah, and when an insurance premium for a single voyage jumps from a fraction of a percent of the hull's value to several percentage points, the math completely breaks down for the shipping company. A modern VLCC supertanker and its cargo of oil can be worth easily north of $200 million.
Wow.
When the insurance cost spikes, the shipping executives simply declare the route economically unviable. They refuse to sail. The actuaries, responding to the military threat, effectively enforce the blockade on Iran's behalf without a single shot needing to be fired.
I understand the mechanism there, but I want to push back on the broader impact, specifically regarding Western economies. Because if you dig into the U.S. Energy Information Administration data, they note that the United States currently produces a massive amount of its own domestic energy. Thanks to the shale revolution, the U.S. is a major exporter. In fact, the data clearly states that in 2024, the U.S. only imported about 7% of its crude oil from the Persian Gulf.
Right.
So if the U.S. is barely buying Middle Eastern oil, why should a listener in America, or even in well-supplied parts of Europe, really care if the strait is closed? If the oil is going somewhere else, isn't it just someone else's problem?
Well, that assumption that domestic production insulates a nation from global shocks is a fundamental misunderstanding of how commodity markets function.
Okay, unpack that.
Energy does not trade in isolated national silos. Oil and liquefied natural gas are globally fungible commodities. Every barrel is intrinsically linked to every other barrel. To understand why a listener in the US or Europe will feel this instantly, you have to track the destination markets for the energy flowing out of Hormuz.
And the EIA estimates outline this clearly. Over 84% of the crude oil and condensate and 83% of the LNG passing through the strait is destined for Asian markets. We are talking about the massive industrial engines of China, India, Japan, and South Korea.
Exactly. The Asian economies are overwhelmingly dependent on the uninterrupted flow of Gulf energy to power their manufacturing centers and heat their cities. When the strait closes, Asia is instantaneously starved of its primary energy source. Do we expect those highly industrialized, massive economies to simply shut down their factories, turn off their power grids, and wait patiently for the geopolitical crisis to resolve?
Obviously not. They have cash, and they will go to the global market to buy whatever alternative supplies exist.
They will aggressively enter the spot market and bid for any available cargo they can find. They will buy crude from West Africa, from South America, from the North Sea, and yes, massive amounts from the United States. They will bid aggressively for flexible, seaborne LNG cargoes originating in the U.S. Gulf Coast or Australia.
So suddenly, Europe and Asia are locked in a vicious, zero-sum bidding war for a pool of global energy that just shrank by 20% overnight.
The price goes up universally for everyone. A barrel of oil pumped in Texas suddenly becomes vastly more valuable because a buyer in Japan is willing to pay a massive premium to secure it. So the American refinery buying that Texas oil has to pay the higher global price, and that cost is immediately passed on to the consumer at the local gas pump. You pay the global price, regardless of the geographic origin of the specific hydrocarbons in your tank.
And the ripple effects go far beyond just what we pay to fill our cars or heat our homes. The analysis from the HIIA does an incredible job of mapping the hidden dependencies and the brutal supply chain shocks. When you blockade the Persian Gulf, you aren't just trapping fuel, you're trapping the foundational raw materials required to build the modern world.
Yeah, the data on these broader sector impacts is genuinely staggering. Consider the agricultural sector.
Okay.
The nations bordering the Persian Gulf leverage their massive natural gas reserves to produce petrochemicals. As a result, the region produces 34% of the world's global exports of urea and roughly 20% of diammonium phosphate. These are absolutely critical, irreplaceable components for global fertilizer production.
Because the supply is trapped, the global price of fertilizer has already surged by 40%. And here is how that impacts the listener directly. If fertilizer becomes prohibitively expensive, farmers around the world are forced to use less of it, or they have to pass that massive cost increase down the line. That directly threatens global crop yields for the 2027 harvest, which guarantees an aggressive spike in fundamental food prices at the grocery store for everyone.
Then you analyze the impact on the technology and manufacturing sectors. The Gulf region supplies roughly 1/3 of the world's helium and an astounding 2/3 of the world's bromine.
And bromine isn't something people usually think about, but it is physically essential for the modern tech economy. Bromine compounds are heavily utilized in the complex chemical processes required to manufacture advanced semiconductors, memory chips, and they're used as critical flame retardants in high-end electronics.
The irony is profound here. The massive global economic growth projected for 2025 and 2026 was largely predicated on the productivity gains from the AI boom. But the servers and the highly advanced chips required to power that AI revolution physically require materials that are now trapped behind an asymmetric naval blockade in the Middle East. The tech supply chain is stalling.
And the logistical capacity to move goods is crippled as well. The sources point out the impact on aviation. Middle Eastern airlines, the massive carriers operating out of Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi, account for roughly 15% of the global air freight and international passenger markets. A massive portion of that capacity is now heavily curtailed due to the severe dangers of operating in regional airspace and localized aviation fuel shortages. So the cost to urgently air freight a pallet of iPhones or a critical medical device halfway across the world just skyrocketed.
Right. And all of these compounding supply chain shocks culminate in a severe, unavoidable human cost. The OECD is flashing red warning lights across all their economic dashboards, indicating that inflation is threatening to resurge, just as global central banks believe they had successfully tamed it. The European Central Bank has already published estimates suggesting an immediate, direct 0.5% bump in baseline inflation, purely from the initial weeks of the shock.
And the tragedy of inflation is its asymmetry. It disproportionately devastates lower-income households. The economic data makes it abundantly clear lower-income families are forced to spend a much larger percentage of their total take-home pay on non-negotiable basic necessities like heating, electricity, and food. When the cost of keeping your lights on and buying a loaf of bread spikes because fertilizer and global LNG prices surged, it just destroys purchasing power.
It acts as a highly regressive, invisible tax imposed by distant geopolitics.
So we have established the mechanics of this massive economic devastation unfolding globally, purely because one country decided to lay mines and point missiles at a waterway. Which brings me to a fundamental, structural question. If this closure is financially crippling the entire globe, doesn't international law have something definitive to say about this? Isn't it explicitly illegal to just choke off the world's economy? That leads us directly into the incredibly murky, contested waters of maritime law.
Yeah, it gets complicated fast. The foundational legal framework governing the oceans is the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, universally referred to as UNCLOS. This treaty is often called the Constitution of the Oceans. Under UNCLOS, specifically within the text of Article 38, international choke points, like the Strait of Hormuz, are designated under a specific legal regime known as transit passage.
Transit passage. Okay, break down exactly what rights that specific term grants to the rest of the world.
Well, the right of transit passage guarantees that all ships and aircraft, whether they are commercial supertankers or military warships, regardless of what nation's flag they fly, have the unalienable right to continuous and expeditious transit through the strait.
So they can't be stopped.
Crucially, the law explicitly dictates that the coastal states bordering the strait cannot suspend this right of transit passage under any circumstances, not even during times of severe geopolitical crisis or heightened domestic security threats. The legal architecture recognizes that these narrow geographical bottlenecks are so fundamentally vital to the global commons that local national sovereignty cannot be allowed to override international navigational rights.
Okay, to ground this in a terrestrial analogy, it is like having a vital, massive 6-lane international interstate highway that just happens to cut directly across someone's front lawn. The homeowner absolutely holds the deed to the property, but the international community has agreed that they do not own the asphalt. They are legally prohibited from putting up a toll booth, erecting a roadblock, or demanding to search the cars driving past their porch.
That is an excellent structural analogy for how UNCLOS views transit passage. However, international law is only as strong as its enforcement, and this is where we encounter the massive interpretive loophole that Iran strategically exploits.
There's always a loophole.
Always. The navigable shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz, those incredibly narrow 3.2-kilometer channels we discussed earlier, happen to fall completely within the 12 nautical mile territorial waters of Iran and Oman. Because the physical water lies within that boundary, Iran looks at the map and claims absolute sovereign control over those specific shipping lanes.
But wait, didn't Iran participate in the creation of UNCLOS? Didn't they sign the treaty that guarantees transit passage?
They did sign the convention in 1982, and this is the critical legal pivot. They never ratified the treaty into their own domestic law through their parliament. Yeah, Because they never ratified it, they argue they are not bound by the transit passage provisions. Instead, Iran relies entirely on a piece of domestic legislation they passed in 1993. Under their internal legal framework, they forcefully reject the concept of transit passage and instead claim that the waters of the strait are subject only to the much older, more restrictive doctrine of innocent passage.
I want to make sure the distinction here is crystal clear. What is the functional, real-world difference between a ship having the right of transit passage versus the right of innocent passage?
It is a massive difference in the balance of legal power. As we established, transit passage is absolute and cannot be suspended. Furthermore, it allows military vessels to transit in their normal operational modes, meaning submarines can stay submerged and hidden while traversing the strait. Innocent passage, on the other hand, is a significantly weaker protection for the foreign ship and grants massive authority to the coastal state. Innocent passage dictates that submarines must surface and show their flag. More importantly, it grants the coastal state the legal right to temporarily suspend passage or require prior authorization to enter the waters if the coastal state determines that the passing ship threatens their peace, good order, or national security.
I see the maneuver. So Iran is structuring a legal argument. They are essentially saying the United States and Israel just conducted a military strike against our sovereign facilities on February 28. That represents an undeniable existential threat to our national security. Therefore, under our interpretation of innocent passage, we have the absolute legal right to block ships from nations aligned with our attackers to defend our shores. They are weaponizing the legal terminology.
Precisely. It is a highly sophisticated tactic recognized in geopolitical circles as lawfare. They utilize strategic legal ambiguity and competing interpretations of unratified treaties to justify their physical blockade as a lawful defensive measure, rather than an act of unprovoked illegal aggression against global trade. They are challenging the very foundation of the post-WWII maritime order by asserting that their domestic security imperatives completely trump the international community's right to freedom of navigation.
But let's look at how these legal theories collide with reality on the water. If a commercial tanker is attacked or if a ship hits a mine in the dark, how do you actually prove who pulled the trigger in a court of international law? If a mine detonates and Iran simply releases a statement saying, "We didn't put that mine there, it must have been an accident or a rogue group," what does the international community do?
You have hit upon the immense, paralyzing problem of attribution and the legal doctrine of state responsibility. In the realm of international law, to legally blame a sovereign state for a hostile action and hold them formally accountable, for example, bringing a case before the International Court of Justice, you must definitively prove that the state apparatus had effective control over the specific attackers at the moment the act occurred.
Effective control, meaning the burden of proof requires you to demonstrate that a specific Iranian military commander gave a direct order to a specific sailor in a specific boat to drop that specific mine on that specific night.
Exactly. And the evidentiary threshold for proving effective control in an international tribunal is incredibly high. Iran navigates this legal requirement brilliantly by deliberately muddying the waters. They extensively utilize proxy actors, such as heavily arming the Houthi militants in Yemen to attack ships in the Red Sea on their behalf. They also employ what military strategists call gray zone tactics.
Tactics that fall below the threshold of traditional armed conflict.
Yes. They might utilize advanced GPS spoofing technology to emit fake satellite signals, tricking a commercial ship's navigation system into believing it is safely in international waters when it is actually drifting dangerously close to the Iranian coast, giving Iran a pretext to seize it. Or they might conduct targeted cyber interference against a vessel's critical engine management systems, causing a blackout at a crucial navigational moment. Or, as we discussed, they deploy naval mines covertly in the dead of night, using unmarked civilian dhows.
It's a strategy built entirely on plausible deniability. They can just shrug their shoulders on the international stage and say, "We have no idea why that ship's GPS failed. Must have been a technical glitch. Prove it was our electronic warfare unit."
This creates a phenomenon that maritime law experts refer to as the sliding scale of disruption. Traditional international law is inherently binary. In the eyes of a treaty, an act is generally either legal or illegal. Two nations are either in a formal state of war or they are in a state of peace.
But the reality of the conflict in the Strait of Hormuz is not binary at all. It is a massive gray gradient.
Exactly. Iran understands that they do not necessarily have to launch a barrage of cruise missiles and physically sink a U.S. aircraft carrier to achieve their strategic goals. Sinking a carrier crosses a clear, undeniable legal red line that would instantly trigger a massive, symmetrical military retaliation that Iran would lose. Instead, they operate on that sliding scale. They engage in just enough harassment, swarming massive tankers with dozens of armed speedboats in intimidating naval parades, increasing the power of their electronic jamming arrays, boarding ships for safety inspections, making vague but menacing threats on state-run media broadcasts to systematically raise the perceived risk environment.
And we circle right back to the economic multiplier. As soon as the risk environment hits a certain threshold on that sliding scale, the insurance actuaries step in. The war risk premiums go up by 50%. The shipping executives look at the cold, hard math of the balance sheet and conclude it simply is not worth the financial risk of losing a $200 million ship and its cargo. So they voluntarily drop anchor and refuse to sail.
Through this sophisticated blend of lawfare and gray zone harassment, Iran successfully achieves a de facto, impenetrable economic blockade of the strait without ever crossing the explicit legal threshold that would justify a massive unified military response from the international community. They perfectly exploit the murky gaps where the law is weakest.
So if launching a massive military intervention is incredibly risky and could easily spark a wider, uncontrollable regional war, and if international law is riddled with interpretive loopholes, proxy problems, and a complete lack of enforcement mechanisms, then it seems the only tool the world has left is diplomacy. The old-fashioned approach of people sitting in rooms hashing out a deal.
Which brings us to the final, and in many ways the most frustrating dimension of this crisis, the diplomatic chessboard. When the military option is too dangerous and the legal option is paralyzed, who actually has the leverage to step up and make the next move to resolve this?
Based on the geopolitical briefs provided in the sources, it seems abundantly clear that the traditional international institutions we usually rely on to solve these crises are completely gridlocked.
They are entirely paralyzed. The United Nations Security Council is theoretically the primary international body tasked with maintaining global peace and security. But any substantive binding action from the UNSC requires unanimous agreement, or at the very least abstention, from the 5 permanent veto-wielding members. Right now, the Security Council is deeply fractured, with rival superpowers backing opposing sides of this specific Middle Eastern conflict. They completely neutralize each other's diplomatic efforts with vetoes.
And what about the organization specifically dedicated to the oceans?
The International Maritime Organization, the IMO, is a highly effective body when it comes to setting global technical standards for ship safety, crew training, and preventing oil spills. However, they are fundamentally a technical agency. They do not possess the mandate, the geopolitical authority, or the enforcement teeth to resolve intense, militarized conflicts between sovereign states. Furthermore, when Western nations, particularly the US and the UK, attempt to organize their own ad hoc naval coalitions to protect commercial shipping, those efforts are frequently viewed with deep suspicion by local regional actors who frame them as unwanted neocolonial military overreach.
So what does this all mean? If the UN is stuck in a veto loop, the maritime agencies are powerless, and US-led coalitions are viewed with deep suspicion. Who actually has the power to fix this? And here is the profound geopolitical irony that the HIAA analysis points out. The United States, the dominant military power in the region, is practically begging its biggest geopolitical and economic rival, China, to intervene and save the global economy.
The diplomatic pivot to China is arguably one of the most defining and consequential aspects of this 2026 crisis. We have to analyze China's strategic dilemma. As we established earlier, China is the world's largest importer of crude oil, and vitally, they are a massive purchaser of Iranian oil. Current estimates show they buy over 1.8 million barrels of Iranian crude every single day, often securing it at a significant discount through dark fleet transfers.
So Beijing is, without question, Tehran's most lucrative and vital customer.
By a massive margin. For China, having the Strait of Hormuz closed is, as one of the geopolitical analysts explicitly described it, economic suicide for their own energy security. The Chinese industrial machine desperately needs that oil flowing to maintain its domestic stability. Because of this massive buyer-seller dynamic, Beijing theoretically possesses immense economic leverage over Tehran. The U.S. logic is that China could simply call the Iranian leadership and issue an ultimatum: reopen the strait immediately, or we cease all oil purchases tomorrow, and your sanctioned economy completely collapses.
But the reality on the ground is that China is not issuing that ultimatum. Why aren't they using that leverage?
Beijing has publicly issued very measured diplomatic statements calling for de-escalation and regional stability. But historically and consistently in this current crisis, China has demonstrated a profound reluctance to actively enforce a Western-led, rules-based maritime order. Their foundational foreign policy doctrine is based on non-interference in the internal security affairs of other sovereign nations. Furthermore, if you look at the situation through the lens of pure geopolitical game theory, keeping the United States military and diplomatic apparatus bogged down, stressed, and expending vast resources in the Middle East might actually align perfectly with China's broader long-term strategic goals, provided, of course, that their own domestic energy disruption doesn't reach a fatal tipping point.
It creates a massive, paralyzing diplomatic vacuum. You have the country with the unmatched military power to theoretically open the strait, the United States lacking any viable diplomatic leverage or open channels of communication with Iran. And you have the country with the ultimate diplomatic and economic leverage, China, refusing to step into the role of global maritime policeman.
Which is exactly why the source material, particularly the forward-looking legal and diplomatic analyses, forcefully argues that the world desperately needs a completely new paradigm for maritime diplomacy. The 20th century tools, UN vetoes, and aircraft carrier diplomacy are simply not functioning against the realities of 21st century hybrid threats.
What does that new diplomatic paradigm actually look like in practice?
The experts synthesizing this crisis propose three fundamental structural shifts. First, they argue for the establishment of a localized, non-binding Gulf Maritime Security Forum. Instead of the U.S. dictating terms or the UN Security Council trying to force a binding resolution, this forum would be facilitated by trusted, neutral states-nations with a history of mediation like Oman or Switzerland. The goal is to bring all regional actors, including Iran, to the table for practical dialogue about maritime safety, completely divorced from the high-stakes pressure of signing binding international treaties.
It creates a safe, localized space to talk about avoiding ship collisions and miscommunications without forcing any nation to feel like they're signing away their sovereignty.
Precisely. The second major shift is a heavy institutionalized reliance on Track 2 diplomacy. Track diplomacy is formal, state-to-state interaction ambassadors and foreign ministers. Track 2 involves unofficial back-channel discussions heavily utilizing academics, retired military officials, industry experts, and non-governmental actors. When official relations are completely frozen and ambassadors are recalled, these Track 2 channels remain open. They are vital for passing nuanced messages, preventing catastrophic military miscalculations, and brainstorming creative compromises that politicians cannot publicly suggest.
And the third shift in this new paradigm?
The third shift is perhaps the most revolutionary. Explicitly integrating commercial actors directly into high-level security dialogues. Historically, naval diplomacy was exclusively the domain of admirals and State Department officials. But in a modern hybrid war, the actual physical targets taking the hits are commercial shipping companies, the merchant mariners, and the maritime insurers. The analysts argue that these commercial entities must be given a permanent seat at the diplomatic table because they are the ones dealing with the daily reality of GPS spoofing, the cyber jamming, and the brutal economic math of navigating a blockade.
It is the equivalent of treating the symptom and the disease simultaneously. You bring the patient directly into the doctor's consultation room to explain exactly where it hurts, rather than just having the doctors guess from an X-ray.
That is a very accurate way to frame it, because right now, the traditional diplomatic and legal systems are fundamentally failing to protect the very people and the very economic lifelines they were originally designed to safeguard.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive. We have analyzed the intense military realities of A2AD, the sweeping global economic shockwaves affecting everything from fertilizer to microchips, the interpretive loopholes paralyzing UNCLS, and the immense gridlock on the diplomatic chessboard. When you take all of these sources together, what is the ultimate defining takeaway from the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis?
The ultimate takeaway is a recognition that the fundamental nature of the global energy market has permanently and irrevocably shifted. For the last 50 years, the primary anxiety driving global economics and geopolitics was production capacity. The world was constantly terrified by the concept of peak oil. We obsessed over exactly how much oil and gas was actually left in the ground beneath the Arabian Desert and whether the OPEC nations would decide to physically pump enough of it out to meet the insatiable demands of global growth.
The entire focus of our anxiety was on the source of the commodity.
Exactly. But the reality today is that there is plenty of energy available in the ground. The U.S. is pumping record amounts. The Gulf has massive reserves. The 2026 crisis proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the singular driving force and the ultimate vulnerability of the global economy is no longer production capacity. It is delivery credibility.
Delivery credibility.
The absolute determining factor for global economic stability today is whether a physical product, whether that is a barrel of crude oil, a cryogenic tank of liquefied natural gas, a shipment of diammonium phosphate fertilizer, or a pallet of advanced semiconductors, can be safely loaded onto a commercial vessel, insured at a financially viable rate, and sail through an international choke point to its final destination without being sunk by a cheap drone or blocked by a lawyer arguing over the definition of innocent passage. The ultimate vulnerability of the modern world isn't in the oil well, it is in that 21 miles of incredibly contested water.
Which brings me back to the image we started with. The global economy as this vast, humming, interconnected machine that is currently holding its breath. We built this machine. We built a completely interdependent, just-in-time global economy based on a very specific, very optimistic assumption. We assumed that the oceans belong to everyone, that freedom of navigation was a settled fact, and that the international laws governing the global commons would hold firm under pressure. But if international law only truly works when every single nation agrees to play by the rules, and if a single regional power utilizing cheap drones, asymmetric proxy actors, and a stockpile of acoustic sea mines can literally hold the entire global economy hostage without firing a traditional shot, are we entering a new era? Are we entering an era where controlling physical geographic choke points is ultimately more powerful than any international treaty ever written? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis. Keep questioning the world around you, keep looking beneath the surface of the headlines, and we will see you next time.